After a journey of 3 years and over 10,000 pages, I finally finished all of what I consider to be mainline Malazan, and oh man, what a journey it has been. These have really been some of the most enjoyable books I've ever read, and the world just goes so much in depth. The reason I really loved this series was because of the world building and the moments of revelation you get over these books because of how well Stephen built his world and his characters. While some other stories like A Song of Ice and Fire or The Kingkiller Chronicles might have better stories traditionally, the Malazan universe just really puts it to shame because its world is just so deep, and the others, while they also deserve the title of epic fantasy, it's Malazan where it really tells you what it is, and this is just the peak of literature. First off, there will be no major spoilers, so I will be giving away no major plot points, and even if I mentioned some names or some events, you'll probably forget it if you haven't read it yet by the time you get there, and if you have read it, then you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'll get into the actual tier list now. I'll go by the intended reading order that Steven Erikson has declared, so it's just the main 10, and then with the God is Not Willing in between after House of Chains because it fits there, and then in the end I'll also talk about Forge of Darkness and Fall of Light. I won't talk about the Jan Sieselmont books because I haven't actually read them, so let's get started with Gardens of the Moon. Gardens of the Moon is a weird one for me because it's such a hard book to start with, but you have to start somewhere. And I guess it's also such a hard book to write. And you can notice that Steven Erikson has really struggled with this book because the prose isn't as great yet as with some of the older books, which is to be expected, I guess, with the first part of such a big epic fantasy series that tries to achieve so much. One compliment I can definitely give this book is that it was the fastest book I got through in the entire series. Maybe that's because it's just 700 pages, but maybe that's also because it's just a new series and it just fascinated me to no end. Because in this book, so many new systems are introduced, and then in the next 10 books, that's all built upon. It's all really starts in Gardens of the Moon, and while it's not as strong as some of the others in terms of story or in terms of emotions or in terms of world building, it's still a really solid entry, and I couldn't rate it below B tier, honestly, even in comparison with some of these amazing books. So let me just say here that if I rated these against any other book series, it would probably all be at least A tier every single book because I just love this series so much. So compared to the Kingkiller Chronicles, compared to A Song of Ice and Fire, it doesn't matter what. Malazan is just a tier above it. And yeah, as I said before, Gardens of the Moon really starts off with that because it really starts building that world. It introduces so many great characters to us and so many good systems like the Warren system, or just the understanding of the Malazan armies with all of the ranks and the intricacies between the characters and the races and everything, and how old each race can get. And it just sets a very solid foundations for all the books to come. And while Gardens of the Moon doesn't have the strong points that some other books in the series definitely have, it's still a very necessary book and a very good way to introduce such a huge series. And if I compared it to any other series, it would probably be at least A tier or even S tier, even though it's definitely not the most enjoyable book I've ever read, I'd say. But for its 700 pages and as a start to the series, it's great. This always was the strongest point of Erikson's writing for me. It's that moment of revelation when you finally think you understand some system and when you finally fit some puzzle pieces together. And then when you get to do that over Gardens of the Moon, it already feels nice, even though it's pretty hard. I like at the start when I started reading it, I really tried to figure out every system, but he doesn't give you all puzzle pieces ever, not even in all the books. So trying to do it at the first book is really pointless. But I had fun with it, even though I didn't get anywhere, and then soon abandoned that project. But just seeing that complex world and then trying to actually assemble a puzzle is what made this book so much fun for me. So yeah, for assembling the systems and everything, this book is at least B tier. Then we get to the actual heavy hitters already in the second book. Deadhouse Gates is, I think, one of the community favorites, and I also really liked it. And I'm looking forward to rereading it at some point because, yeah, all of the characters and the story arc is so good. Like, what was lacking in Gardens of the Moon, Deadhouse Gates definitely makes up for in the storylines of Valicine and Heboric, and in the storylines of the Malazans, and also Coltane and the Crow clan with the Jane of Dogs. It's just, yeah, this is where Malazan really pulls you in. And if it doesn't, I don't know if this series is gonna be for you, but if it does, it can really hit hard. It gets so emotional at the end. It is probably one of the best endings, probably the best ending in the series already in the second book, which is insane to me because we don't know the characters that well yet. We haven't yet had 10 books of character development. It's just the second book, but already these endings hit so damn hard. The reason I'm not putting it in S tier is because there's just stronger books in this series, despite this being a definite masterpiece. And at the time when I read it, it became one of my favorite books of all time. So if you're here after just reading Gardens of the Moon, please at least read Dead Out Gates and Memories of Ice, and then see if you want to continue this series. Because even though it's another 1,000-page book, it's definitely worth continuing if you've already read Gardens of the Moon. What also sets Deadhouse Gates apart is it's the first time where we learn to really trust Erikson. Because after just learning so many concepts and characters in the first book, we now move to an entirely different continent, and we once again know nothing of the characters except for a few bridge burners. And this is where it really grew on me, his storytelling style. Because Erikson really likes using the different point of views and actually just tells a story through them. The characters are not the central piece, except some of the really large ones. Sometimes he introduces a character for just one chapter, introduces it, gives him a story, and then kills him again in the same chapter. And we learn that it's just a vessel for actually understanding the story. And it doesn't matter if that character then is never mentioned again, he still had a POV. He was part of the story, and we're grateful that he did his job of dying, I guess. There's also a larger version of this, with some characters in this book being very focal points of the book, and then they just aren't around in later books anymore. And I won't say much more because it would be too heavy of a spoiler, but it's amazing just seeing how they are then redefined by other characters in the series, and actually telling the fake history that then becomes the history because our characters that we actually experienced in the book are not around anymore to defend their viewpoint, which is really sad, but it also really hits home to see how powerful some of these other characters are. For the third book, we have Memories of Ice, and without even a doubt, this goes into S tier. Even though it's still early in the series and there's still plenty of great books to go, this is really where it starts to peak for Malazan. What makes this book so great is its emotional peak, definitely. The story, while solid, isn't what really makes it great. It's the characters and then how the characters are used inside the story to produce emotions in us. Also combined with themes like compassion that actually just all converge like Erikson's book in the end in general to then hit us right in the feels. And this book has done it better and stronger than any book I've read before or since. It's just in a different league in terms of thematic and emotional storytelling. What we also finally kind of understand in Memories of Ice is what I talked about before in Gardens of the Moon, is that Erikson really likes his systems and his kind of concepts, and he builds upon them book upon book upon book, and then in the end they become something a lot greater. And they are transformed each book and they are built upon, and we are really trying to assemble a puzzle like, what is Shadow Throne, why does he exist, or who is Cruel and why does he exist, or how powerful is he immortal, is he a god? We're never explicitly told, we just have to figure it out ourselves. And that's what I love about this series, because over time it produces more and more events where we really finally have some moments of understanding after reading thousands of pages. And these moments are so few and far between that they are so rewarding as they finally happen. Next is House of Chains, and while I really tried to rank it higher, I couldn't really get it over me to rank it higher than C tier. And once again, this is subjective, and other people may rate it actually a lot higher than this, and I've heard it even being one of people's favorite books, but for me, the characters and mostly just the story didn't really do it. Like, there's some of my favorite characters again from Deadhouse Gates because we're on Seven Cities again. So Felicine is around again, Heboric is around again, and yeah, I really enjoyed these characters and the introduction, which lots of people hate with Karsa Orlong. It's just a quarter or a third of the book is just Karsa, and I really love this. This is actually a reason for me for ranking it higher, maybe, but I couldn't justify it doing that just for that. But the introduction of Karsa, and then finally understanding that he is the same Toblakai that we met in Deadhouse Gates was really amazing, a great moment. So even the weaker books in the series for me still have great parts. So the introduction and then the characters are still just as great, but just the overall story and the rest of the book didn't do it for me. And I think for me this was the weakest ending in any of the books, and I didn't enjoy the convergence that happened here, as in all of the Malazan books, as much as in most of the others. Maybe this is just because I haven't really grown to like Tavor at this point, but yeah, it didn't hit as hard as some of the others. But then this is where I'll talk about The God is Not Willing, because it's basically the first third of House of Chains. The God is Not Willing is just the story of Karsa Orlong and what then happened after he left Silver Lake and the Topalkai area, and how his presence, or rather absence, actually formed these places, and how his bastard is doing, and everyone he left behind. And because I really liked the start of House of Chains, I also really loved The God is Not Willing, and I'll actually put this behind Deadhouse Gates in A tier, because while its story is also not that great, it's the first time that actually following the Malazan garrisons really did something for me, which I really enjoyed. But also just the Toblakai and seeing what happened after Karsa left was just such a great journey. It could just be that I'm a sucker for just strong characters with bone clubs, but I'll take that, I guess. Still a great book. Next up, we have the fifth book in the series, which is Midnight Heights, which is another absolute banger and one of my favorites, if not my favorite of the entire series. I'm not quite sure about that, and I'll see about that later. For now, I'm probably gonna be putting it behind Memories of Ice, because that single moment in Memories of Ice just really hit me as hard as nothing else. But Midnight Heights did so well in the thematic storytelling and once again the characters that I couldn't recommend it enough. Once again, we just have to trust Erikson, because we now go to an actual continent where we know no person except for Troll Sengar introduced in book 4, which is this kind of weird Tistador we didn't think much about. And then it's just the entire fifth book is basically his backstory, which is amazing. And yeah, what a play, man, Erikson. And that I would enjoy it this much, to be actually leaving behind all of the characters again, and even leaving the systems behind again, because here the warrants don't even apply in quite the same way. It kind of works different with the holds and everything, and Erastas. But Midnight Heights, with its characters like Buck, Tehol, Rulad, everyone in this storyline is just great. And once again, we see another facet, and we see that not all of these concepts are just set in stone. It's not even one system for the whole world. Depending on where we are, it's different systems. So the puzzle has just expanded a lot. And then we get to see this undead emperor, and all of this is behind the greatest theme in the entire series, which is the Leferi people's greed. Lefer is the continent, and the Leferi are the inhabitants of Lefer, and just the greed of their people is then really their downfall. And this also plays a lot into Reaper scale, but here in Midnight Tides, for me it peaks. And then seeing Bug and Tehol, which is probably my favorite duo in the series, tied only with one of the Carcanis trilogy's duos, but they're just so funny, and I never thought I could enjoy a comedic duo in such a somber and dark story as much as I enjoyed Bug and Tehol. And they really didn't take away from the darkness and from the seriousness of the entire story in total. They really just added to it, despite never being serious. The Bone Hunters is easy to rank because it's just B for Bone Hunters. I'd say it goes here because while it had two very amazing parts with the start, which is in Igathan, I don't know how to pronounce this, and then the end, which is in Mala City. Both of these plots I enjoyed immensely, and in the end, seeing Kalam move through Mala City is really badass, and he does so well. And yeah, these two scenes with Igafanov and the fire and Mala City really drew me in, but the rest of the book just kind of is just there to connect these moments and didn't really do that much to actually further my understanding of the world and enjoy it a lot. So while The Bone Hunters was a solid entry, for me it just lacked the peaks that all of the other books had, once again, which is a theme in these books. And once again, they're all solid books, but some of them just have a lot higher peaks. And an exception to this would maybe be The God Is Not Willing, because this is just here because it's just a very good book in general. It doesn't have the peaks of the other three that are above it, but it's just very good in general. And then Guardians of the Moon, Bone Hunters, and House of Chains either aren't on the quality of The God Is Not Willing or just aren't as peak heavy as the others, which is why the Bone Hunters goes in B tier. One thing I forgot to mention about Midnight Tides is also the scene in the, I don't know what it's called, in the end when the Adur are invading in the city. The scene with the Seda Kurukan was just really one of the best moments in the entire series. I really enjoyed it. Finally, after seeing this madman search for a single title for the entire book, seeing the big payout finally, and actually having a badass fight. Now we're here with Reaper Scale, and Reaper Scale is another very solid entry in the series, and it goes to the top of B tier for me. It plays again, once again, on Leffer, and yeah, that by itself it just makes it a very solid entry. All of the Briss storyline was just great, and Tehol and Buck are good as ever together, and just the Rulat storyline of him just challenging all these people, and then all of the book having the tension of thinking, will Ikarium be unleashed and will he actually clash, and then seeing that storyline resolved. Yeah, just that storyline in itself, even without all of the Malas stuff with what's it called? The one Malas mage that we hadn't heard a lot about, finally having his epic moment. Yeah, just all around great vibes and solid enough to go to the top of B tier. Toll the Hound is another absolute banger, and it goes to the middle of A tier behind Deadhouse Gates, because just for the single scene in, I don't even know, I think it's Darchistan, right? Yeah, it has to be Darchistan. The whole fight there with, I won't exactly spoil who, but just the fight inside the city with all of the parties involved and the hounds which are on the cover and everything just makes it such a good clash, and probably one of the best convergences we've had all series. What also made this so great is actually, I wish I had read this after Carcanus, but this has so much payoff for the Carcanus trilogy, because if you've read Carcanus after reading Toll the Hounds, you're already reading it with these events in mind. And in Toll the Hounds, it's just so much. It's maybe the most that actually happened in the world of Malazan over the entire series. So just the most, does this make sense? Just the characters that have been around so long, like Draconis and Anamander Rake, and they just having payoffs 300,000 years after their books of Fall of Light and Forge of Darkness is just insane to me. And this single clash in the city just instantly makes Toll the Hound's A tier, even if I don't remember all of the details of the books anymore. Next up is Dust of Dreams, and I know you might hate me for this, but Dust of Dreams is at the top of C tier because while I love the concept of the snake and while I hate the four color soil, even though I think their concept of justice is really interesting, yeah, it's you really notice that it's just built up for the crippled god the whole way through. I didn't enjoy some of the characters as much anymore. I didn't really understand the thematic things except for like the entire row of children, which is always a big theme in Malazan, to save the children and what empire can claim to be just if they don't look out for the children. But yeah, other than that, Dust of Dreams is not the strongest of the works in this book. But yeah, I get that it's supposed to be read just before the Crippled God, and the Crippled God more than makes up for this C tier Dust of Dreams, which becomes quite a bit too lengthy for my taste, because in the end I was getting way too tired. And to be fair, I read these two books as an audiobook, so I think I probably would have enjoyed it more actually reading it physically, or at least on my Kindle, but reading it as an audiobook didn't really get me as good as some of the others. And then we get the Crippled God. This is another hard one for me because I think I'm being unfair because I only read it as an audiobook, but for me it only goes to the top of A tier. It's not an S tier with Memories of Ice and Midnight Tides because I just. So, my reason for putting the Crippled God into A tier is just that many of the characters in the series I was most invested in were Anomander Rake, it was Draconis and everything around Draconis, and then it was Icarium and Karsa and Rulat and Troll, and all of these characters don't really play a major role in the Crippled God, which makes it not as investing for me as it could have been. While it does have really strong motifs, and I think I'm really gonna read this again as an audiobook, or I'm gonna read it physically because I think I'm being unfair to this. But still, as it stands, as it emotionally impacted me, I can't really justify putting it above A tier because it just I'm sounding like a broken record here, but it didn't do what Midnight Tides and Memories of Ice did for me, and what was peak Erikson writing for me. And while there were revelations in The Crippled God, like big revelations, I was never that invested into the Crippled God storyline, and I was more confused by it. And this might, and I think this would change on a reread because I would grasp more of the themes in The Crippled God. But for me, it just was a great finale, and it was top of A tier, and I loved this book and devoured it and listened to it in like 1.5 weeks, but still not as strong as the others. Which is the last two books. This is the main 10 done, and now we're getting to the Carcanis trilogy. And this might be controversial right after rating the Critical God A tier, but Forge of Darkness goes into S tier. If you disagree with this, please fight me in the comments. I've seen people put these in D tier and I really can't understand it. They are pretty unapproachable and I can definitely see why people wouldn't like them, but I adore this book. It's just so complex and all of the characters, and I just really enjoyed seeing how Civil War can come to be and how stupid the reasons are and how little actually holds civilization together. And this single theme, along with the characters and the backstory of the Azaphani and everything of the world building, it just did exactly what I needed. And also Fall of Light continued this beautifully, and it probably goes right behind Toll the Hound, because while it didn't add as much on top of Forge of Darkness as that book. It's still a very solid entry, even though the ending really freaked me out and I'm kind of confused by it. But just these two books and seeing what Civil War does and seeing how Anaminder Rake and Silka's Ruin and the Wrist and all other Tist Andi and all the Chughoot and Hood and yeah, it's just great books. And they are the two that I've read most recently, though they're the strongest in my mind. So keep that in mind. There's probably some recency bias, but Forge of Darkness and Fall of Light, I think, will keep being some of my favorite books in the series. So this is it. This is my tier list, and it may look pretty top heavy. There's like almost five A tiers, three B tiers, and only two C tiers and three S tiers. And normally there should be like one or two S tiers and then three A tiers, and the rest should be B and C tiers. But for me, this this just incorporates what Malazan is. It's just all of the books are so strong, and if you still haven't read all of them, please go and do that. I will still be continuing with the Esselmont, even if Erikson didn't write it. I will go for them. If you enjoyed this tier list, please consider subscribing. I'm gonna be doing some similar content in the future about the books, and I'm mostly gonna be theming my channel around books now, I think. And so I would really love if you left a subscription. Thanks.